The air itself is cool, carrying the lingering chill of the night, and it has a smell that you know as well as your own hands, a blend of dried lime and clean animal hide with a hint of the river's dampness and the faint woody scent of the oak beams overhead. You stand still for a moment just inside the door, letting your eyes adjust and your breathing slow to match the stillness of the room. Outside, the city is just beginning to stir. A cart rumbling distantly over cobbles while a single bird calls from the shadow of the roof, and somewhere far off the Seine moves against its quays with a low, continuous murmur. After this pause, you step further in, your boots making a soft, regular sound on the boards. The workbench runs along one wall, a heavy table of elm whose surface has been worn to a satiny smoothness by years of use, and upon it, arranged in their appointed places, lie the tools of your day. The curved lunellum knife rests on a folded linen cloth, its wooden handle, darkened by the oils of your palm, fitting perfectly into a depression that your hand has shaped over time. The blade itself is broad and gently curved, not sharp like a cutting edge, but thin enough to lift the finest shavings from a stretched skin, and it catches the light along its polished surface, a sliver of silver in the dimness. Next to it sits a block of chalk, dense and white, a piece trimmed from a larger mass months ago that now bears the flat, worn facets of repeated rubbing, along with a pumice stone that is grey and porous yet surprisingly smooth on one side where your grip has burnished it. There is a small clay pot of water, a folded rag, a brass ruler, and a little heap of scrapings from yesterday that you have not yet swept away, each object holding its place with a quiet certainty, the way things do when they belong to a routine that has not changed in many seasons. Farther into the room, standing upright near the window, is the wooden frame. You turn toward it, and your gaze travels over the structure that holds the half-finished skin you left there the evening before. The frame is made of oak, sturdy, seasoned oak that has not warped in all the years it has stood in this workshop. Its four members joined at the corners with mortise and tenon and pegged tightly, the wood a deep honey-brown burnished in places where your body has brushed against it. Across the frame, the vellum is stretched by a system of twisted flax cords that run from the edges of the skin to a series of wooden pegs set into the frame's sides, each cord pulling with a gentle, even tension that you check now with a quick, habitual glance. The flax is pale gold and slightly fuzzy, and where it wraps around the pegs it has worn small grooves into the wood. The skin itself is still damp enough to hold its tension, its surface opaque in the dim light, a ghostly rectangle that seems to float within its wooden cage. Beside the door, on a peg made from a whittled piece of oak, hangs your work apron. It is a length of heavy linen, once natural in color, now faded to a soft grey-brown from years of absorbing chalk dust and pumice powder and the faint grease of animal skins, the fabric folded and creased so many times that it holds the shape of your body even when empty and hangs limp and patient, waiting. You cross to it, lift it from the peg, and loop the neck strap over your head, letting the apron fall against your chest before tying the side strings loosely with fingers that find the familiar position without thought. Then you turn to the other peg beside it and hang your cloak, a simple woolen wrap that still carries the night's chill in its folds, and it settles against the wall with a soft rustle as you smooth it once with your hand. There is a basin on a low stand near the door, a shallow earthenware bowl filled with water that you drew from the courtyard well before you left last evening. The water is cool, almost cold, and it has collected the faint mineral scent of the clay. You dip your hands into it, cupping the liquid and letting it run over your fingers and palms, washing away the residue of sleep. The skin on your knuckles tightens slightly at the chill, and you rub your hands together under water, feeling the familiar calluses at the base of your thumb and along the sides of your forefinger, the small ridges of hardened skin that come from holding the lunellum day after day. When your hands are clean, you shake them gently over the basin, then dry them on the linen rag that drapes over the stand's edge. The rag is rough and absorbent, leaving your fingers slightly warmer, and now you are ready. You walk the few steps to the wooden frame and stand directly before it, your toes just touching a dark knot in the floorboard that you have stood upon 1,000 times. The window is to your right, and the growing light now reaches fully into the room, spilling across the floor and climbing the legs of the frame. In this strengthening illumination, the vellum begins to reveal itself. What was a uniform pale sheet in the dimness now shows subtle variations of thickness, faint shadows that map the geography of the animal that once wore this skin. There is the gentle ridge along what was the spine, a slightly more opaque line running from top to bottom, along with the softer, thinner areas of the flanks and the tiny, barely visible dots of hair follicles scattered like a constellation near one corner. You do not touch the skin yet. You simply stand and look, letting your eyes travel over every part of it, reading its surface the way a scribe might later read a page. The light continues to change as the sun, still hidden behind the buildings of the city, climbs higher beyond the eastern walls. The grey of earliest dawn yields to a pearly, colourless brightness, and then, very gradually, a faint wash of warmth enters the room. Not the yellow of full morning, but a hint of it, a promise carried in the light. The dust motes in the beam become more visible, glinting now like tiny specks of mica, and you watch the way the light touches the vellum, how it passes through the thinner sections with a soft, translucent glow, while resting on the thicker parts with a creamy opacity. The skin seems almost to breathe under this inspection, held in its perfect tension by the flax cords that bite gently into its edges, and you notice a tiny area near the lower right corner where the tension has eased slightly overnight. You make a mental note to turn that peg a quarter rotation later, but for now, you simply observe. You fold your arms loosely across your chest and let your weight settle evenly on both feet. Your breathing deepens, slow and steady, matching the quiet rhythm of the workshop. The city outside continues its distant hum, a bell from the direction of Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre ringing out the hour of prime, with notes muffled by walls and distance, the sound of water from the river merging with the occasional cry of a gull. But these sounds are far away, removed from the peaceful enclosure of the room. Inside, the only noise is the soft creak of the oak frame as it adjusts to the slight change in temperature and the nearly inaudible whisper of the dust settling. You remain motionless before the vellum, allowing your mind to quiet, allowing the day ahead to settle into the same calm that inhabits the stretched skin. There is no hurry. The skin will wait, the light will grow, and the scraping will begin when the moment is right, and not before. For now, it is enough to stand here, in the first light over the Seine, and look. The skin, held in its frame before you, has not always been here. It began elsewhere, in a part of the city you have never visited, and it arrived on a morning some weeks past, rolled loosely and wrapped in damp cloth, carried by a boy who set it on your bench, without a word before vanishing back into the street. You remember that morning now as you stand before the frame, your hands still at your sides, the light from the window growing stronger and warmer, beginning to touch the vellum with a pale gold that deepens the cream of its surface. The skin has a history, a quiet sequence of events that unfolded in places of water and stone, and though you did not witness them, you can trace them now with your fingertips, reading the surface as if it were a record of its own making. You lift your right hand and place it, palm down, on the upper left corner of the stretched sheet, letting your fingers spread slightly. The vellum is cool and faintly damp, not wet, but holding a residual moisture that gives it the feel of something living, something that has not yet fully forgotten the animal it once was. Under your hand, the surface is smooth in some places, and subtly textured in others, a landscape of tiny variations that you know by heart. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sensation travel up through your palm and into the memory stored in your fingers, the years of touching skins at every stage of their preparation. When you open your eyes again, you begin to move your hand slowly downward, tracing the grain. The first thing you feel is the faint ridge that runs from top to bottom, a gentle swelling in the thickness that marks where the animal's spine once lay. It is more opaque than the surrounding areas, as if the material remembers the central structure that held the creature together, and as your fingers cross it, the texture changes from the smoother flanks to a slightly denser, more resistant band. You follow this ridge all the way down, your hand moving at the slow pace of a cloud crossing the sky, and then you shift your palm to the left, exploring the softer, thinner area that corresponds to the belly. Here the vellum is almost translucent, a quality that will later make it perfect for the pages that need to glow with gold leaf, and your fingers detect the faintest rippling, a pattern like the surface of water just before a breeze arrives, caused by the natural movement of the living animal's muscles. You pause and lift your hand away, holding it just above the surface, and you notice the tiny dots of hair follicles scattered across the lower portion. They are barely visible, more a suggestion of texture than a mark, and they remain because the liming process, thorough as it was, could not erase every trace of what the skin once carried. You let your gaze rest on these specks without judgment, simply observing them as part of the material you will transform. Then you lean closer, and the smell of the vellum rises to meet you, that familiar blend of dried lime and clean animal hide, with a slight sweetness underneath that comes from the residual natural oils not yet fully washed away. The scent triggers a chain of quiet thoughts, not memories exactly, but impressions of the stages the skin has passed through, and you allow these impressions to surface and subside as you continue your slow inspection. Long before the skin came to this frame, it was part of a calf, a young animal that lived in the countryside north of the city and whose life was brief and unremarkable, ending in a butcher's yard on a cold morning when the breath of the men and the beast alike rose in white plumes. You do not dwell on this moment, you simply acknowledge it as a fact, the necessary starting point from which all vellum begins. The hide was removed with care because a skin destined for parchment must be cut cleanly and without unnecessary holes, and then it was packed in salt to preserve it for the journey to the tannery district near the river. The salt drew out the moisture and tightened the fibers, leaving the skin stiff and grey, and it arrived in Paris in a cart loaded with other hides, bumping over the rutted roads, wrapped in coarse sacking that left a faint weave pattern on the surface that the liming would later erase. At the tannery, which stands beside one of the channels of the Seine where the water flows clean and fast, the skin entered the first of its transformations. The lime pits are sunk into the earth near the riverbank, rectangular hollows lined with stone and filled with a milky solution of quicklime and water that bubbles slowly and gives off a sharp, acrid scent that clings to clothing and hair. The skins are lowered into this bath and left to soak for many days, sometimes 2 weeks or more, during which time the lime works into the hair roots and loosens them from their follicles. You imagine, as you run your hand again over the faint follicle marks, the slow chemistry of that soaking, the way the lime water would have penetrated the hide's layers, swelling the fibers and preparing them to release their outer covering. The process is quiet and patient, requiring no human intervention once the skins are submerged. Just the steady action of the alkali on keratin, and the workers at the tannery would have turned the skins occasionally with long wooden poles, ensuring that every part received an equal exposure. When the hair had loosened sufficiently, the skin was lifted from the lime pit, dripping and heavy, and laid across a curved wooden beam called an unhairing beam. The worker who performed the next task used a blunt wooden blade, not a metal knife, because metal can cut or score the hide, while wood simply pushes and scrapes. You can envision this blade, broad and flat, with a handle worn smooth, and the motion of drawing it across the skin in long, even strokes that separated the hair from the grain. The hair came away in clumps, mixed with the creamy lime residue, falling into a pile at the worker's feet, and the smell at this stage would have been strong, a combination of wet animal, lime, and the faint, not unpleasant earthiness of the hide itself, revealing its inner structure. The worker would have worked methodically, starting at one end and progressing to the other, turning the skin and repeating the process on the flesh side to remove any remaining membrane and fat. This is why the surface you now touch feels so clean and uniform, because some unknown pair of hands spent a morning drawing a wooden blade across it again and again until nothing superfluous remained. After the unhairing, the skin needed to be rinsed, and for this it was taken to the river. The Seine flows past the tannery district with a steady, unhurried current, its water carrying the silt of distant fields and the reflections of clouds, and it provided the final wash that removed the lime and the loosened debris. The skin was submerged in the cold greenish water and agitated gently by hand, held under the surface while the current pulled through it and carried away the last traces of the alkaline bath. You picture the water streaming over the skin, the way the grain side would have looked pale and clean, the flesh side a softer, more fibrous surface, and how the man rinsing it would have checked it by holding it up to the light, just as you do later in your own work, to ensure the translucence was even and no opaque spots remained. The rinse in the river also began the process of returning the skin to a neutral state, washing out the lime so that the vellum would not become brittle over time, and the natural color of the hide started to emerge from the white lime coating, a warm, living cream that you see before you now. Once rinsed, the skin was carried, still wet, to the stretching frame. The frame used at this preliminary stage is much like your own, though larger and cruder. Set up in an open shed where the air circulates freely and the skin was attached to it by a series of cords, or sometimes by wrapping the edges around small smooth pebbles that the cords could grip without tearing. The stretching is a gradual process, beginning with a moderate tension and increasing over time as the skin dries, and the man who did this work would have adjusted the pegs every few hours, turning them a little at a time to pull the skin flatter and thinner. You know this rhythm well, because you will repeat it later. But at the tannery, the goal was simply to produce a flat, even sheet that could be stored and transported, not yet to achieve the final thinness of a book page. The skin dried on that frame, shrinking and tightening until it sang a low note when tapped, and then it was cut free, trimmed roughly into a rectangle, and stacked between boards with other skins before being brought to you. All of this you hold in your awareness as your hand moves over the surface, tracing now the edge of the hide, where the flesh side shows a subtle nap. A Swede-like softness that contrasts with the polished smoothness of the grain. You notice a faint irregularity, a small thickening where a vein once ran close to the surface, a tributary of the animal's circulatory system, now preserved as a delicate, translucent line. Your fingertip follows this vein, which forks once and then fades into the general texture, and you think of the blood that once moved through it, warm and constant, a thought that passes without emotion, simply another layer of the skin's quiet history. The skin does not remember the life it once enclosed. It is now only material, and yet it carries the marks of that life as calmly as a stone carries the imprint of a leaf that fell on it long ago. You withdraw your hand and take a small step back, observing the whole sheet again. The light has moved during your inspection, climbing higher and striking the vellum at a slightly different angle, revealing new details. The grain side, which faces you, has a natural sheen in certain areas that catches the morning brightness, a gloss that comes from the fine structure of the dermis, and that will later accept ink without bleeding. The edges of the skin, where the flax cords bite into the material, show small impressions that are evenly spaced around the perimeter, like the marks of stitches in cloth, and these will be trimmed away when the sheet is cut to its final size. The frame hums with tension, the flax cords singing a very faint, high note if you listen carefully, and you lay your palm flat on the wooden crossbar to feel the vibrations, the way the whole apparatus is alive with the stored energy of the stretched hide. Now you lean in again and bring your face close to the surface, so close that your own breath mists the vellum for a second before fading. The smell of lime is fainter now than it was when you entered, replaced by the cleaner scent of the hide itself, a scent that reminds you of new leather, but lighter, less cured, with a hint of the river water still caught in the deeper layers. You tap the surface lightly with your knuckle, and the sound is a muffled, resonant thump, lower than the note you would achieve after further scraping, but already promising in its solidity. You tap again, a little farther down, and the pitch changes slightly, becoming a touch higher where the skin is thinner, a touch lower where it is thicker, a quiet, subtle music that only someone who has done this for years would notice. You tap 3 more times, slowly, listening, and then you stop, satisfied that the tension is even and the skin is ready. Your inspection is nearly complete. You look one last time at the whole expanse, from the top edge to the bottom, from the left cord to the right, and you note the small area near the lower right corner where the tension has eased slightly overnight, a relaxation you noticed earlier in the dawn light. You will attend to this later, a simple quarter turn of the peg that will restore the perfect flatness. For now, you simply stand with your hands resting on the frame's oak side pieces, feeling the grain of the wood under your thumbs, the smooth polish of years, and you let the quiet of the workshop settle around you completely. The skin has finished its long journey from pasture to tannery to this room, and it awaits only your blade, which lies on the bench behind you, ready to begin its own slow, repetitive work that will transform this half-finished material into the luminous pages of a book of hours. The moment arrived when looking was no longer enough. You turned from the frame and walked the 3 steps to your workbench, where the lunellum waited on its folded linen cloth, the curved blade catching the light from the window in a thin, bright arc. You lifted it with your right hand, your fingers finding the familiar grooves worn into the wooden handle, the place where your thumb rested and the slight hollow where your forefinger curled around the grip, and you held it up briefly to check the edge. The blade was not sharp in the way of a cutting knife. Its edge was keen but fine, a smooth, polished bevel that would skim a translucent layer from the surface without biting too deep, and the morning light ran along it like water along a glass rim. Satisfied, you lowered the tool to your side and returned to the frame, positioning yourself once again, with your toes at the dark knot in the floorboard, your body square to the vellum, your shoulders relaxed. You paused before the first stroke, allowing the stillness to settle one final time. The window light was now fully established, a steady, diffused brightness that bathed the skin in an even glow, and the room had warmed just enough that you no longer felt the coolness of the early hour. The skin hung in its frame, waiting, its surface a pale field of potential, and you chose your starting point with the same care a scribe might choose the first word of a prayer. The upper left corner, near the edge where the flax cords pulled the vellum taut, where a slight thickness remained from the animal's shoulder. You placed the blade against the surface at a low angle, the flat of the blade merely parallel to the skin, the curved edge resting on the grain side with the lightest possible pressure, and then you drew down. The first stroke produced a sound that entered the quiet room like a long, soft exhalation, a sustained shush that began at the top of the sheet and continued all the way down to the bottom edge, where the blade lifted away with a delicate, final whisper. A curl of vellum rose before the blade, a translucent ribbon as fine as the inner membrane of an eggshell, its color the palest cream with a hint of gray at its thinnest edge, and it gathered in front of the lunellum for the length of the stroke before falling gently into the pile of scrapings that had lain on the floor since yesterday. The scent that rose from the fresh cut was faint but distinct, a clean, almost grassy smell, the smell of the hide's inner layers meeting air for the first time, releasing a trace of the lime bath and the river water and the natural oil still held within the fibers. You paused after the first stroke, tilting your head slightly to inspect the path the blade had taken, a pale, matte stripe on the gloss of the grain side, and then you repositioned the lunellum for the second. The second stroke overlapped the first by half a blade's width, the right edge of the lunellum aligned with the center of the pale stripe left by the first stroke, ensuring that no ridge would remain between them. You drew down again, the same even pressure, the same low angle, and the sound returned, a second sustained shush that matched the first in pitch and duration, rising and falling only as the grain of the skin varied slightly under the blade. This curl, slightly narrower because of the overlap, lifted and fell onto its companion, and the pile of scrapings grew from a tiny heap into a small, soft mound, its texture like the finest wood shavings, its color lightening as it dried in the air. You did not count the strokes, because counting would have pulled your mind away from the rhythm of the work, but you settled into a pace that felt as natural as breathing, each stroke a complete cycle of placing, drawing, lifting, and returning to the top. The lunellum, as it moved, translated the surface of the skin into a new language of texture. Where it passed, the glossy grain gave way to a matte smoothness, a surface like fine suede that would later be polished with pumice until it became a satin. Your right hand controlled the pressure, a delicate balance maintained by the muscles of your forearm and the sensitivity of your fingers, feeling through the wooden handle every tiny irregularity the blade encountered. A place where the skin was a fraction thicker required an infinitesimal increase in pressure, communicated not by thought but by instinct, and a thinner section, one of those translucent areas near what had been the belly, required a corresponding lightness, a barely there touch that you applied without consciously deciding. The skill lived in your hand, not in your mind. And while your hand worked, your mind drifted into a quiet, receptive state, aware of the light and the sound and the smell, but fixed on nothing, a calm mirror of the room. You scraped downward, stroke after stroke, across the full width of the skin's leftmost section. Each draw of the blade lasted the same duration, the time it took for the lunellum to travel from the upper edge to the lower edge, about the span of 3 slow breaths. At the bottom of each stroke, you lifted the blade, and in that small pause before the next stroke, you sometimes glanced at the curl forming, watching it separate from the surface and roll into a thin spiral before dropping. Or you looked out the window at the patch of pale sky visible above the rooftops. Or you simply closed your eyes for a half-second, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the waking city. Then you placed the blade again, aligning it with the same half-overlap, and drew downward again. The physical sensation settled into a steady, repeating pattern. The handle of the lunellum, warmed now by your hand, seemed to meld with your palm, and the slight vibration of the blade against the skin traveled up your arm in a continuous low hum that you felt in your wrist and elbow. Your left hand, which you kept resting lightly on the frame's crossbar, absorbed the quiver of the stretched skin, a faint tremor each time the blade passed, as if the vellum were a drumhead and the lunellum a mallet striking it with the softest of blows. The muscles of your back and shoulders, which had been loose at the start, settled into the posture of the work, a comfortable, balanced stance that you could maintain for hours without fatigue. The pile of scrapings grew, spreading outward from the spot where the first curl had fallen, and the sun, climbing almost imperceptibly, shifted the window's reflection on the floor by a hand's width. When you had covered the width of a full blade from the left edge of the skin across, by overlapping strokes a strip about 4 fingers wide, from top to bottom, you stopped and straightened, rolling your shoulders once without urgency. The matte strip stood out clearly against the still glossy remainder of the vellum, a record of the work you had done in the past minutes, and you ran your fingertips over it to check the consistency. The texture was even, the surface clean, the thickness already approaching the transparency that would make the page suitable for writing. You nodded to yourself. A small, almost imperceptible dip of the chin, and then you shifted your weight, stepping half a pace to the right so that your body aligned with the next unworked section, and you began again. The blade placed at the top, the downward draw, the shush sound repeating, the curl lifting, the slight pause at the bottom, the return to the top. The new column of strokes overlapped the previous one by just a thread, ensuring that the join between the worked and unworked areas would be invisible. And as you scraped, you noted without thinking the way the grain of the skin changed slightly here, a subtle variation in the texture that the blade translated into a slightly different resistance. The vellum, being a natural material, was not uniform. It held the memory of the animal's body, areas of greater density where muscles had worked, areas of suppleness where the skin had stretched over ribs, and each of these required a tiny, instinctive adjustment that you made without breaking the rhythm. Your breathing, which had been shallow at the start, deepened and slowed until it matched the pace of the strokes, a 4-count inhale and a 4-count exhale that carried you through the work like a gentle tide. The light continued its patient migration across the floor, the beam from the window now angling more steeply and warming the air enough that you felt a faint, pleasant heat on your left shoulder. The pile of scrapings had spread into a pale, soft carpet at your feet, and the individual curls were drying into crisp, fragile forms that would later be swept up and given to the glue maker, or simply scattered in the courtyard for the birds to carry away. You noticed these things without focusing on them, the way you might notice clouds moving while your mind is elsewhere, and you continued scraping. By the time you had worked across a full arm's length of the skin, from the left edge to the midpoint of the frame, your right arm had settled into a rhythm so steady that it seemed to move without your volition. The pattern place, draw, lift, place, draw, lift had become a kind of mantra, a physical repetition that quieted the chatter of the mind and left only the pure, simple fact of the work. The lunellum, now coated with a fine dust of vellum powder, occasionally needed a wipe, and you would pause every few minutes to draw the blade across the linen cloth that hung at your belt, a quick, habitual motion that cleaned the edge and restored its bright gleam. Then you would return the blade to the vellum and continue, the shush sound picking up exactly where it had left off, seamless and uninterrupted. As you worked, you became aware of the subtle music the blade produced. The pitch of the scraping varied slightly with the thickness of the skin, a higher, thinner note where the vellum was most translucent, a lower, fuller note where it was denser, and the combination, heard across the span of minutes, formed a gentle, unplanned melody, like wind moving through different leaves. This sound, combined with the faint creak of the oak frame and the distant murmur of the Seine, created an acoustic cocoon that wrapped the workshop in a profound quiet, and within this quiet, the act of scraping seemed not like labor, but like a form of rest, a stillness expressed through motion. You scraped across the center of the sheet, where the spine ridge ran, and here the blade met the densest part of the vellum. The sound deepened, and the pressure required increased slightly, a shift that you accommodated by leaning forward a fraction more, transferring a tiny amount of additional weight through the handle. The curls here were less translucent, a touch thicker, their color a warmer cream, and they dropped more heavily into the pile, landing with a soft, papery rustle. Once past the spine, the skin thinned again, and the blade lightened, the shush rising in pitch, and you moved through these transitions smoothly, the way a boat moves from deep water to shallow, without changing its speed. The minutes accumulated, uncounted. A bell rang somewhere in the city, the distant note of Saint Julien-le-Pauvre remarking an hour that you did not register, and the sound drifted through the window and faded, absorbed by the quiet of the room. You had scraped now across 2/3 of the skin's width, and the matte surface had grown, the gloss receding step by step as the blade advanced. A slow conquest of texture that would eventually claim the whole sheet. Your body felt light and balanced, your mind empty and calm, and the work continued. When you reached the final section, near the right edge of the skin, you paused to tighten a peg that had loosened slightly, rotating it a quarter turn, with a sharp, clean creak of wood against wood. The skin tightened instantly, its surface becoming more resonant, and you tapped it once with your knuckle before returning the lunellum to its path. The last column of strokes, narrower than the others because of the proximity to the chords, required a slightly adjusted grip. The blade held a little more vertically to avoid the edge of the frame, and you negotiated this change without a break in the rhythm, finishing the final stroke with the same sustained shush that had begun the work. The blade lifted for the last time on that side, and you stepped back. The entire grain side, from the left edge to the right, now bore the mark of the lunellum. The surface, which had been glossy and irregular, was now a uniform matte, soft to the eye, its color a pale, even ivory that glowed in the morning light. You looked at it for a long moment, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a day's first task completed, as it should be completed, and then you drew the linen cloth from your belt and wiped the blade thoroughly, removing the fine dust that had accumulated along its curve. The lunellum was warm in your hand, and you laid it back onto the bench, on its folded cloth, before turning again to face the frame. The skin would now need to be loosened and turned, the flesh side exposed, and the whole process repeated, but that would come later. For now, you simply stood and let the quiet hold, the room peaceful and still. The pile of scrapings at your feet, a soft, pale testament to the beginning of the day's work. With the grain side now a uniform matte expanse, you set the lunellum aside and turned your attention to the frame itself, to the flax cords that held the skin in its precise tension. You loosened each peg in order, moving clockwise around the frame, the oak pegs creaking softly as they rotated in their sockets, the twisted cords going slack one by one. The vellum, released from its four-sided pull, relaxed with a subtle, almost inaudible sigh, its surface rippling faintly, before settling into a gentle, shallow curve. You lifted the skin from the frame, handling it with the care you always used, your fingers supporting it from beneath so that no fold or crease would mark the material, and you carried it the few steps to the workbench, where you laid it flat, grain side down, on the clean, smooth elm. The grain side, still slightly damp from the morning's work, made a soft, tacky sound as it met the wood, and you smoothed it once with your palm to ensure it lay perfectly even. Now you walked back to the frame and began the methodical process of repositioning everything for the flesh side. The flax cords, which had been loosened, needed to be re-threaded through the edges of the skin, and this you did with a patience that had no need to hurry, passing each cord through the small reinforced holes that the tannery had punched along the perimeter, drawing them snug but not yet taut. The flesh side faced you now, and in the growing morning light its character was immediately different. Where the grain side had been smooth with a natural polish, this side was softer, more fibrous, covered in a fine velvety net that caught the light and held it, diffusing the brightness into a tender, dusty glow. The color was a slightly deeper cream, and the surface was marked here and there with the faint, branching traces of blood vessels that had once run close to the inner surface of the hide, delicate, fern-like lines that the liming and unhairing had revealed, rather than removed. Once all the cords were threaded, you began to tighten them, moving from peg to peg, turning each one a half rotation at a time, in the same clockwise order. As the tension returned, the skin lifted from its sag and drew flat, the flesh side stretching into a smooth plane, the nap rising slightly as the fibers pulled apart under the strain. You stopped periodically to run your hand over the surface, checking the evenness of the stretch, feeling for any slack or uneven pull, and you adjusted individual pegs with micro-turns that corrected the balance. The frame creaked and settled. The flax sang its low, tight note. And at last the vellum was as taut as it had been for the grain side, a resonant drumhead ready for the blade. You fetched the lunellum from the bench, wiped it once more on the linen cloth, and positioned yourself at the frame. Working the flesh side required a different touch, and you felt your grip on the handle shift almost imperceptibly as you prepared. The blade angle, which for the grain side had been nearly parallel to the skin, now needed to be raised by a few degrees because the nap was softer and wanted to bunch under a flat blade rather than shear cleanly. The pressure, too, had to lighten, for the flesh side was more delicate, lacking the grain's tough outer layer, and a heavy hand would tear rather than scrape. You understood this not as a set of rules, but as a bodily memory, a knowledge that lived in your wrist and forearm from years of this same adjustment, and you made the change without a thought, the way a bird adjusts its wings for a different wind. You placed the blade at the top of the skin on the left side as before, but this time the initial contact was softer, the metal barely kissing the fibrous surface. Then you drew downward, and the sound that emerged was not the sustained shush of the grain side, but a lighter, drier whisper, a faint, rapid rustle like a very distant breeze passing through dry grasses. The blade moved smoothly, the raised angle preventing any grabbing, and behind it a new kind of curl appeared. These scrapings were finer than those from the grain side, almost powdery, not the translucent ribbons of before, but a delicate dusty film that lifted and then drifted sideways, caught by the air currents of the room, before settling in a soft, pale snowfall around your feet. The light from the window caught these drifting particles as they fell, turning them into a slow, silent cascade of motes, each one glinting faintly before joining the growing pile on the floorboards. You continued downward, stroke after stroke, each one overlapping the last by that same half-blade width. The rhythm re-established itself, but with a gentler pulse, a tempo that matched the softer surface. Your right hand, which had borne the steady resistance of the grain side, now felt a lighter feedback through the handle, a delicate, papery sensation, as if you were planing a sheet of the finest silk. The nap, which had stood upright before the blade, was reduced stroke by stroke, the surface emerging from beneath the lunellum as a smoother, closer texture, still with a faint Swede-like softness, but now even and uniform, free of the longer fibers and the tiny irregularities that had caught the light unevenly. At regular intervals, you paused to wipe the blade, drawing it across the linen rag at your belt, and now you noticed that the dust from the flesh side was different, finer and stickier, clinging to the metal with a slight static charge that required a firmer wipe. You cleaned the edge thoroughly each time, restoring its bright gleam, and then you returned the lunellum to the skin, picking up the rhythm without a seam. The pile of scrapings beneath the frame grew in a broad, shallow mound, paler than the grain-side scrapings, almost white where it was thickest, and the scent that rose from it was a milder version of the earlier clean-hide smell, with a faint, dry, papery undertone, like the scent of very old books opened in a quiet room. A book of hours, you knew in the quiet back of your mind, required pages that balanced two opposing qualities. The vellum had to be thin enough that light could pass through it, giving the painted illuminations a luminosity that seemed to come from within the page itself when held before a candle or a window, but it also had to be strong enough to hold ink without buckling, to endure the pressure of the scribe's quill and the repeated turning of fingers over years of prayers. This balance lived in the scraping, the slow reduction of the skin, until it reached that precise thickness where translucence and strength met, and you worked now toward that invisible threshold, your hands guided by experience rather than measurement. The grain side, which you had already scraped, provided the smooth, ink-ready surface, while the flesh side, now being reduced, would determine the final thinness and the evenness of light transmission. Both faces had to be finished with the same care, because a page that was too thick in one spot would cause the ink to pool, and a page too thin would tear under the scribe's corrections. You scraped across the full width, moving from the left edge toward the center, the lunellum's gentle rustle filling the room. As you approached the midline, where the spine ridge was thicker even on the flesh side, you felt the resistance increase slightly, and you adjusted by leaning forward a fraction, not adding pressure so much as allowing the blade's weight to do the work. The sound changed, becoming a deeper, slower rasp, and the scrapings from this area were a touch coarser, though still finer than anything from the grain side, and they fell more directly into the pile, not drifting as far. Then, past the spine, the thinning resumed, and the blade lightened again, the whisper returning to its higher, softer pitch. You worked through these transitions without noticing them, your attention diffused, your mind a still pool that reflected only the light and the sound, and the gentle, repetitive motion of your arm. When you had covered half the skin's width, you paused once more and took a step back, rolling your shoulders and letting your gaze drift out the window. The sky beyond the rooftops was a pale, clear blue, and the sun, now high enough to clear the buildings opposite, sent a shaft of warm light directly onto the frame, illuminating the flesh side with a revealed glow. In this light, the areas you had already scraped showed a subtle satiny sheen, while the unworked half remained dull and fibrous, and you could see the boundary between them as clearly as the line between sea and shore. You turned back to the bench and took up a small piece of the pumice stone, not to polish yet, but to test, rubbing it lightly across a scraped section to smooth a tiny rough spot that your fingers had discovered. Pumice left a faint grey-white trace that you blew away gently, and then you set the stone aside and returned to the blade. The second half of the skin received the same unhurried treatment, the same soft whispering strokes, the same fine drifting dust. As you worked, you found yourself aware of the thickness in a new way, not through sight or sound, but through the vibration that traveled up the lunellum's handle into your palm, a hum that told you with every stroke how much material remained between the blade and the air beyond. A slightly heavier vibration meant a thicker section, a lighter, fluttering sensation meant thinness. You read this code without decoding it, adjusting the pressure in a continuous fluid feedback that kept the blade at exactly the right depth, never cutting too far, never skimming too shallow, but skimming the precise layer that needed to be removed. This was the quiet, wordless knowledge of your craft, and it filled the room as surely as the motes of dust filled the light. By the time you had scraped across the full width of the flesh side, the sun had moved again, the angle of its beam shifting across the floor and climbing the wall behind the frame. The pile of scrapings had grown so that it now brushed your ankles when you stepped close, a soft, pale accumulation that you would need to sweep before midday, and the room was filled with the dry, clean scent of worked vellum. The skin itself, now scraped on both faces, hung in the frame like a thing transformed, its surface a uniform, pale gold that caught the light with a gentle radiance. The grain side behind it, hidden now against the room, was smooth and matte. The flesh side facing you was a soft, swede-like plane, thin to a fraction of its original thickness. You set the lunellum on the bench and unfastened the skin from the frame a second time, loosening the pegs in reverse order and lifting the vellum away with both hands. It was lighter now, noticeable so, the reduced mass making it feel almost buoyant in your grip, and you carried it to the window, where the full strength of the late morning light poured through the oiled linen panes. You held the sheet up before you, your arms extended, and the light poured through it, translating its thickness into a map of warm, translucent gold. The heart of the vellum, that central area away from the edges, glowed with an even, honeyed tone, the kind of light that a book of hours demanded, a light that would make the painted capitals and the gilded halos seem to float above the page. Along the edges, where the skin had been slightly thicker, the glow was fainter, and you made a note to return to those areas with a smaller blade later, a task for the afternoon. You lowered the vellum, and, following a habit so old you could not remember its origin, you brought it close and pressed the center of the sheet gently against your cheek. The right thickness, the thickness that was strong enough to hold ink yet thin enough to transmit light, had a particular feel against the skin of the face, a coolness and a subtle resistance that could not be measured by any ruler or gauge, but that your body knew. The vellum touched your cheek with a smooth, cool softness, and you closed your eyes for a moment, feeling the slight give under the pressure, the way the material yielded, and then stopped, a silent, tactile report on its readiness. It was not too stiff, which would indicate excessive thickness remaining, and not too yielding, which would mean it had become fragile. It was exactly what it should be, a finish achieved not by calculation but by touch alone. This test, passed from master to apprentice without words, was the final confirmation, and you lowered the sheet with a quiet, satisfied exhalation. You carried the vellum back to the bench and laid it flat, flesh side up, the surface of the wood holding it gently. A few small, uneven patches remained near the edges, and you retrieved a smaller, finer blade from the bench, a miniature lunellum with a handle of polished bone that you kept for detail work. You leaned over the skin and worked these areas with short, delicate strokes, your face close enough that your breath disturbed the fine, powdery scrapings that lifted from the blade. Each patch required only a few strokes, and as you worked, the light from the window illuminated the thin, curling shavings that rose and fell, the smallest of them catching the air and floating for a heartbeat before descending. When the last patch was smooth, you straightened and wiped the tiny blade clean, setting it back in its place. The flesh side now matched the grain side in its finish, a uniform, soft surface that was a pleasure to look upon. The room, which had held the quiet energy of your labor, settled into a deeper stillness, the dust motes drifting more slowly now as the air calmed. You rested your hands on the edge of the bench and looked at the vellum for a long, quiet moment, a sheet of transformed material that had passed through your hands from rough, half-finished hide to a page almost ready for the scribe. The next step would be the pumice powder and the chalk, the final polishing that would close the pores and create the perfect writing surface, but that could wait. For now, the skin rested on the bench, glowing faintly in the warm light, and you allowed yourself the same rest. A quiet pause before the continuation of the work. The bells began, and you paused. It started with Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, the small weathered church across the river whose bell was the first to ring the hour of sext, its note a high, clear tone that cut through the midday air like a single bright thread pulled across the city's murmur. The sound reached your workshop after a small delay, traveling across the water and through the narrow streets, softening as it came, losing its sharp edge until it arrived as a gentle, rounded chime that seemed to belong as much to the room as to the bell tower. A moment later, the deeper bells of Notre Dame answered from their great stone towers on the island, their voices heavier, richer, rolling over the rooftops in long, sustained waves that you felt in your chest as much as heard. The two bells, the light and the deep, wove together in a brief, unhurried conversation, and then, one by one, smaller bells from chapels and convents across the quarter joined in, a scattered constellation of chimes that rose and fell and faded into the steady hum of the city at noon. You straightened from the workbench, where you had been bent over the small blade and the edge of the vellum, and placed your hands on the small of your back, arching slightly to release the quiet stiffness that came from standing still for a long time. The bells continued their ringing, overlapping and then pulling apart, each one eventually falling silent until only the deep, final note of Notre Dame remained, a low, sonorous tone that hung in the air for a long breath before it, too, subsided. The workshop was quiet again, but a different quiet, a midday quiet that was less dense than the early morning stillness, more open, as if the bells had swept through and cleared some unseen accumulation. You wiped your hands on the linen cloth, set the small blade on the bench, and walked across the room to the window. The oiled linen panes were warm to the touch now, heated by the sun that had been shining on them for hours, and you leaned your forearms on the wide sill, letting your weight settle forward. The window looked out over a narrow lane that ran between your building and the next, a cobbled strip that was mostly in shadow at this hour, except for a bright stripe of sunlight along its far edge, and beyond the lane your view opened to the rooftops of the quarter, a jumble of peaked tiles and chimney pots in the occasional dormer window, and beyond those, glimpsed between the buildings, a sliver of the scene that glittered faintly in the noon brightness. The air that came through the gaps around the window frame was warm and carried the smells of a city at its busiest hour, wood smoke from the bakers' ovens, the earthy scent of the river, the faint, pleasant sharpness of freshly sawn timber from the carpenter's yard, a street or two away, and underneath it all the ever-present smell of stone and old plaster that was the background scent of Paris itself. You breathed in slowly, letting the outside enter you, and as you breathed, you listened. The scent carried sounds strangely, reflecting it off the water and the stone quays, so that the voices of the boatmen working along the riverbank seemed closer than they were. You could hear a man calling out soundings now, his voice a regular rhythmic chant, a word repeated every few seconds that you could not quite distinguish, but whose meaning depth warning, navigation was clear in its tone. The sound rose and fell as the barge moved, coming into the open stretch of water visible from your window, and then passing behind the shoulder of a building, fading and then returning, a steady, unhurried pulse of human presence on the water. Behind that voice you could hear the faint creak of oars, and the splash of a pole being thrust into the river, and then the answering shout of another boatman farther upstream, the call and response carrying across the surface in a lazy, liquid echo. From the direction of the carpenter's yard came a different rhythm, a tack-tack-tack of hammers driving pegs, the sound sharper and more percussive than the river sounds, cutting through the warm air with a crisp, wooden clarity. The carpenters were working on a roof frame, you guessed from the regularity of the sound, the hammers setting oak pegs into mortise joints, and the rhythm had the steady, practiced tempo of men who did not need to rush because they knew exactly how long the work would take. Sometimes a hammer would pause, and then a single, harder blow would sound, and then the rhythm would resume, a pattern so regular that you found your breathing aligning with it without intending to. A slow 3-count that matched the rise and fall of the distant hammer. Closer, in the courtyard directly below your window, a woman was washing linen in a large wooden tub, and you could hear the slosh of the water as she worked the cloth against a ribbed washboard, a sound that was softer than the hammers but nearer, more intimate, the water slapping against the sides of the tub, and then the quieter, wetter sound of the linen being lifted and turned. The courtyard amplified sounds in a strange way, its stone walls catching and holding them, and you could hear the woman humming to herself, a tune that you did not recognize, but that drifted up through the warm air in fragments, interrupted by the splash of her work, a melody that never quite completed, but simply looped and restarted, as soothing in its incompleteness as the river sounds. Sometimes another voice, a child's voice, called from somewhere in the building, and the woman answered without pausing her work, her words indistinct, but her tone calm and unhurried, the sound of a household going about its ordinary day. Above all these sounds, nesting under the eaves of the building opposite, a colony of swallows had built their mud and straw nests, and the birds were busy now in the warmth of the day, darting out from the shadow of the roof and wheeling in the bright air before returning with beaks full of insects. Their cries were high and sharp, a rapid, twittering sound that traced arcs across the sky, and you watched them from the window, their dark bodies silhouetted against the pale blue, their flight paths intersecting and diverging in a complex, silent choreography. The swallows were the only creatures moving quickly in the entire landscape of your observation, and even their speed seemed effortless, a natural counterpoint to the slow rhythms of the boatmen and the carpenters and the woman at her washboard. You remained at the window, your weight resting easily on your forearms, your gaze moving slowly from the lane below to the rooftops, to the sliver of river, to the birds and back again. A lazy, absorbing panorama that needed nothing from you. The sun was warm on your face and hands, and the heat, combined with the gentle noise of the city, wrapped around you like a blanket. Your eyes half closed, and for a moment you simply drifted, not sleeping but hovering at the edge of sleep, a pleasant, floating awareness where the sounds blended together and lost their individual meanings, becoming simply a texture, a soft, continuous presence as neutral and comforting as the sound of your own breath. The bells had marked midday, and as you stood at the window you remembered the bread and cheese that you had brought with you that morning, wrapped in a clean cloth and tucked into the small shelf near the door. You straightened and crossed the room, your boots making the familiar, quiet sound on the boards, and you retrieved the bundle from its place. The cloth was cool to the touch, having been kept out of the sun, and you untied the knot and spread it open on the corner of the workbench, revealing a piece of dark, dense bread with a crackled crust and a wedge of hard cheese that had begun to soften slightly at its edges from the warmth of the room. You broke off a piece of the bread and a slice of the cheese, and you ate standing up, your back against the bench, chewing slowly and without hurry. The bread had the mild, nutty taste of rye flour, and its texture was chewy and substantial, requiring a slow, deliberate pace of eating that matched the slow pace of the day. The cheese was sharp and slightly crumbly, a cheese made from sheep's milk that had been pressed and aged until it developed small crystalline flecks that crunched faintly between your teeth, and its saltiness made you thirsty. You poured water from the clay pitcher into the cup that sat it, the water still cool from having been drawn from the courtyard well that morning, and you drank it in small sips, feeling the coolness travel down your throat and spread through your chest. A quiet, pleasant sensation that centered you in your body again after the long, outward focus at the window. Eating alone in the quiet workshop with the sounds of the city drifting through the window was a ritual you had performed so many times that it no longer registered as an event. You did not think about the food or the water or the act of eating. You simply consumed, slowly, standing in the warm light that now filled half the room, your gaze resting on the vellum that lay on the bench beside you, its surface glowing faintly from the light passing through the window behind it. The midday meal was a pause, a gentle seam in the fabric of the day, and you gave it no more weight than you gave to any other part of the work. When you had eaten the last of the bread and the cheese, you wiped your hands on the cloth and then folded it neatly, tucking it back onto the shelf. You drank one more mouthful of water, rinsing the taste of the cheese from your tongue, and then you set the cup down and walked back to the window for a final look. The boatman's voice had faded now, his barge having moved beyond hearing, and the carpenters had paused for their own midday rest. The tack-tack of hammers replaced by the low murmur of voices, and then by silence. The swallow still swooped and cried, tireless, but even their energy seemed to belong to the stillness of the hour, part of the quiet fabric rather than a disruption of it. The courtyard was empty now, the washing finished, the tub turned on its side to drain, and the shadows had shifted so that the bright stripe of sunlight along the lane had narrowed and moved higher up the wall. You turned from the window and stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting your eyes move slowly from object to object, taking in the quiet order that you had maintained all morning. The lunellum on its cloth, the pumice stone beside the chalk block, the brass ruler aligned with the edge of the bench, the pile of scraping still gathered beneath the frame, the half-finished vellum resting flat and smooth on the elmwood, the dust motes still drifting in the light from the window, the shadow of the frame stretching now toward the door. The room was exactly as it had been before the bells, and exactly as it would be after. A calm, steady container for the work that you did. A space that held you as much as you held it. You loosened your shoulders and rolled your neck once, a small habitual stretch that marked the end of the pause, and then you returned to the frame, where the cords were still loose from when you had removed the vellum for inspection. The afternoon's work, the pumice, the chalk, the final polishing waited, but first you had to reset the frame and stretch another skin, one of the unfinished sheets that lay stacked between boards in the corner of the room, covered with a damp cloth to keep them from hardening. You walked to the corner and lifted the cloth, releasing the moist, clean smell of half-prepared hides, and you selected a skin from the middle of the stack, its surface still rough and needing the first scraping, and you carried it to the frame, the pause over, the day moving forward as smoothly and inevitably as the Seine moving past the quays below. The skin you had scraped in the morning now lay flat on the workbench, its grain side and flesh side both reduced to a smooth, even surface, and you approached it again after the midday pause with hands that were steady and a mind that was quiet. The vellum had rested on the elmwood while you ate, and during that time the air of the room, which had grown warmer as the sun climbed, had drawn a small amount of moisture from its surface. When you touched it now, the skin felt slightly drier than before, the cool, damp resilience of the morning replaced by a crisper texture, a faint stiffness at the edges, that told you the material was beginning to set in its reduced state. This was natural, the ordinary behavior of worked hide exposed to air, but it needed correction before you could proceed, because a skin that was too dry would not accept the pumice evenly and might crack under the pressure of polishing. You crossed to the clay pot of water that sat on the corner of the bench and dipped your fingers into it, the water cool and slightly chalky from the clay. You did not pour water onto the vellum, for too much moisture would swell the fibers unevenly and undo the careful thinness you had achieved. Instead, you flicked your fingertips lightly over the surface, casting a fine, sparse spray of droplets that landed on the skin in a scattered pattern, tiny, glistening beads that sat on the grain side for a moment before beginning to sink in. You watched the water absorb, the dark spots where the droplets had landed fading as the moisture spread through the fibers, softening them, and then you flicked again, moving your hand across the full width of the sheet, from the upper left to the lower right, until the entire surface carried a faint, even sheen of moisture that would restore its flexibility without saturating it. You waited while the water did its quiet work, your hands resting at your sides, your gaze moving over the vellum as the slight stiffness relaxed and the skin settled back into its supple state. The color of the material deepened faintly where the moisture had penetrated, a subtle shift from pale cream to a warmer, slightly amber tone that would lighten again as the water evaporated, and you could detect, from the speed at which the sheen faded, whether the absorption was even. In one corner, near the upper right, the moisture lingered a moment longer than elsewhere, suggesting a denser patch that you made a note to check with the pumice. When the skin was uniformly damp and flexible, you lifted it carefully and carried it back to the frame, where the flax cords waited in their loosened state, and you set about restretching it for the next stage of the work. The cords went through the punched holes with the ease of familiarity, and you tightened them gradually, moving from peg to peg in the same clockwise order, each turn of the oak peg drawing the skin a little flatter, a little more taut. As the tension returned, the vellum responded with a quiet, stretched sound, a subtle creaking that was not the frame this time, but the skin itself, its fibers pulling into alignment under the strain. The moisture you had added helped the skin to stretch without tearing, giving it the slight give it needed to settle into the perfect flat plane. When the last peg was tight, you checked the surface with your palm, pressing gently at the center and then at the corners, feeling for any slack or uneven pull, and you found none. The skin was ready for the second scraping, a finer pass than the first that would remove the last, almost invisible layer of irregularity before the pumice could begin. You took up the lunellum again, and this time you held it with a touch that was even lighter than the touch you had used on the flesh side. The blade, which had already reduced the skin to near its final thinness, now needed to skim rather than scrape, to lift only the very surface fibers that had risen during the moistening. You placed the blade at the top of the grain side, the angle slightly higher than it had been in the first pass, and you drew down with a pressure so light that the sound was barely present, a faint high whisper that you felt more than heard, a delicate rasp that travelled through the handle into your palm. The curl that rose was gossamer thin, translucent to the point of invisibility, and it drifted away from the blade in tiny fragmented wisps that caught the afternoon light and glinted once before vanishing into the air. You worked across the full surface, stroke after gentle stroke, and each pass removed so little material that the change was imperceptible stroke by stroke, accumulating only over the span of many minutes into a subtle refinement, a final, barely measurable smoothness. When you had covered the entire grain side, and then, after unfastening and turning the skin, the entire flesh side as well, you stood back and wiped the blade for what would be the last time before the pumice. The vellum was now as thin and even as your skill could make it, its surface a uniform mat that absorbed the light without reflecting it, and it was ready for the stone. The pumice sat on the bench where it had waited all morning, a piece of pale grey volcanic rock roughly the size and shape of a small flattened pear, its surface porous and granular on all sides except one, which years of use had worn to a smooth, slightly concave curve that fit the heel of your hand. You picked it up, feeling its familiar lightness, a substance so full of air that it seemed almost like solidified foam, and you turned it over in your palm, examining the worn face to ensure that no grit or foreign particle had lodged in its pores. The pumice was clean, its surface a fine, even grey, and you carried it to the frame. Polishing with pumice was a different kind of work from scraping, not a linear stroke, but a circular motion, a continuous rubbing action that covered the vellum in small, overlapping spirals. You began at the upper left corner, the same place you always began, and you pressed the smooth face of the pumice against the grain side with a gentle, even pressure, then moved it in a slow circle about the width of your hand. The sound that rose from this motion was a soft, sustained hissing, not unlike the scrape of the lunellum, but drier, grittier, the sound of the fine, porous stone grinding against the fine, smooth skin, each rotation reducing the surface fibers to an even closer texture. A fine, pale powder began to appear at the edges of the stone's path, a dust that was not the skin itself, but the pumice slowly wearing away against the vellum, depositing its mineral fine grit into the pores of the hide, filling them, smoothing them, preparing the surface to receive ink without bleeding. You work the pumice in small sections, each circle overlapping the one before it, advancing slowly to the right and then dropping down to begin a new row. The pattern as regular as a farmer ploughing a tiny pale field. The hissing sound continued without pause, a quiet, steady white noise that filled your ears and blocked out the distant sounds of the city, leaving only the sensation of the stone in your hand and the sight of the vellum changing under its passage. Where the pumice had passed, the surface developed a subtle, satiny sheen, a soft luster that was different from the gloss of the original grain and different from the matte of the scraped surface, a finish that seemed to glow from within rather than reflect from without. This was the surface that would hold the scribe's letters. The delicate hairlines and the thick downstrokes, the brilliant vermilion of the rubrics and the gleaming gold of the illuminations, all of them resting on the foundation you were now laying, circle by slow circle. Every few minutes you paused to blow the powder away, pursing your lips and directing a gentle stream of breath across the worked area. The pumice dust lifted in a pale, drifting cloud, finer than the vellum scrapings, lighter than flour, and it hung in the air for a moment before settling slowly onto the floor, adding a soft, grey-white layer to the pile of scrapings already there. With the dust cleared, you could inspect the surface, running your fingertips over it to feel the smoothness, looking along it against the light from the window to detect any area you had missed. Occasionally you found a spot that needed more attention, a tiny roughness or a pore that had not been filled, and you returned the pumice to that spot, rubbing in smaller, tighter circles until the imperfection vanished. Then you blew the dust away again and continued your slow, methodical progress. The work was repetitive in the way that water is repetitive, flowing over the same stone century after century, and your mind, like the stones, was smoothed by the repetition rather than worn. You did not think about the time or the progress or the tasks that remained. You simply moved the pumice in its circles, breathing the faint, mineral scent of the dust, watching the satin surface spread inch by inch across the skin. The sun, which had been high and bright when you began, descended slowly, its beam from the window lengthening and warming toward the golden tone of late afternoon, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened by degrees, gathering in the spaces behind the frame and under the bench like water welling into a pool. When you had polished the entire grain side, you straightened and stretched your arms above your head, feeling the muscles of your shoulders lengthen, and you stood for a moment in the golden light, blinking slowly like someone emerging from a long, quiet dream. Then you loosened the cords, turned the skin, retensioned the pegs, and began the same process on the flesh side, the pumice making its slow circles across the softer, more fibrous surface, the hissing sound slightly different here, a touch more muffled, the powder a shade finer. The flesh side required less polishing because it would not receive writing, but it needed enough to prevent the pages from sticking together when the book was bound, and you gave it the same unhurried care, the same patient circular rhythm. By the time both sides were polished, the afternoon had advanced into its final phase, the light from the window mellowing to a deep amber gold that cast long shadows across the floor and made the dust motes glow like tiny embers suspended in the warm air. The pumice stone in your hand had worn slightly from the work, its smooth face now a fraction smoother, a fraction more concave, and you wiped it clean on the linen rag before returning it to its place on the bench. The vellum, still stretched in the frame, was now a sheet of quiet radiance, its surface a uniform, soft glow that seemed to hold the light within it. A page almost ready for the scribe's hand. You ran your palm over it one last time, feeling the cool, silken smoothness, the absolute absence of rough or irregular texture, and you allowed yourself a single, small nod of satisfaction before stepping back from the frame and turning toward the bench, where the chalk block waited for the final preparation. The chalk block had been resting on the bench, a rectangular piece of dense white material, harder and finer than the chalk of schoolrooms or market stalls, and you picked it up now with the same easy familiarity with which you had taken up the lunellum and the pumice. The block was cool and slightly dusty to the touch, its edges worn to soft, rounded corners from months of handling, its faces bearing the shallow, curved depressions where your thumb and fingers had pressed into it over time. You turned it over in your hand, feeling its weight, a surprising heft for something so pale and soft-looking, and then you approached the frame where the vellum waited in its final tension, polished by the pumice to a smooth, satiny finish that was almost but not quite ready for ink. The purpose of the chalk was to fill what the pumice could not reach, the microscopic pores and tiny natural indentations that remained in the surface of the hide, even after the most careful polishing, invisible to the eye, but present nonetheless, waiting to catch the edge of a quill or to draw a droplet of ink sideways into an unintended feather. The chalk, ground from a particular seam of stone that came from the hills east of the city, was pure and fine and free of grit, and when rubbed into the vellum, it would settle into every remaining hollow, creating a surface that was perfectly sealed, perfectly uniform, a smooth, white ground that would receive the scribe's letters with the same impartial readiness that fresh snow receives footprints. You began at the upper left corner, as you always began, pressing the flat face of the chalk block against the grained side of the vellum with a moderate, even pressure. The first stroke was a straight, downward slide, the chalk moving from the top of the skin to the bottom in a single, steady motion that left behind a pale, translucent film, a faint cloudiness on the satin surface that marked where the mineral had transferred from the block to the hide. The sound of this stroke was a soft, dry friction, quieter than the hiss of the pumice, and lower in pitch, a gentle rubbing sound that was almost the sound of a hand brushing against a smooth wall. At the bottom of the stroke you lifted the block and returned to the top, aligning it beside the first path with a slight overlap, and you drew down again. The second stripe of chalk merging with the first, the film gradually building from a faint haze into a more visible whiteness. You continued in this way, stroke after downward stroke, covering the skin in a methodical sequence that was the same as the scraping had been, a column-by-column progression across the width of the frame. The arm movement was smooth and repetitive, your shoulder and elbow working in a relaxed pendular rhythm, your wrist barely moving, the chalk block held firmly but without tension. As you worked, the chalk wore slowly against the vellum, depositing itself in an even layer, and the block grew slightly warm in your hand from the friction, a faint, pleasant heat that you felt through your fingertips. The scent of the chalk was faint and clean, a dry, mineral smell like the smell of a stone path after a long, hot day, and it mingled with the lingering scent of the pumice and the hide to create the characteristic workshop smell that you noticed only when it was absent. The white film that spread across the vellum was not a paint, not a coating that sat on top of the skin. It was a filling, a substance that worked its way into the pores and became part of the surface rather than something separate from it. You could see this happening as you worked, the chalk seeming to disappear into the skin even as it left its visible trace, the vellum accepting it, incorporating it, the way dry earth accepts the first light rain. The areas you had already covered took on a paler, more luminous quality, their satin sheen muted slightly by the chalk's matte whiteness, and the contrast between the chalked and unchalked portions was subtle but clear, the boundary moving steadily across the sheet as you advanced. From time to time you paused to check the evenness of the application, leaning close and sighting along the surface against the light from the window. The afternoon sun, now deep gold and slanting steeply, caught the chalked areas and revealed any thin patches where the film was too light or thick patches where it had accumulated too heavily, and you corrected these as you found them, rubbing the chalk block more firmly over the thin spots and buffing the thick spots lightly with the side of your hand to spread the material. The process required a patient attention, not the sharp focus of a new task, but the settled, comfortable attention of a task whose every nuance you understood, and you gave it that attention without hurry, working your way across the skin in the same calm, flowing rhythm that had carried you through the day. When you had chalked the entire grain side, you stepped back and flexed your fingers, which had grown slightly stiff from holding the block, and you looked at the vellum with a quiet, assessing gaze. The surface was now a uniform pale white, not the stark white of paper but a softer, warmer white, the white of cream or of early morning mist, the grain still faintly visible beneath the chalk as a subtle, underlying texture. The skin had lost its slight translucence, covered now by the opaque mineral layer, but you knew from experience that this opacity was temporary, that the next step would remove the excess chalk and restore the glow while sealing the pores, a paradox that the process resolved through the simple physical action of the cloth. You loosened the cords of the frame, turned the skin, retensioned the pegs, and chalked the flesh side as well. A faster process because the flesh side required only a light application to prevent adhesion between pages, not the full, ground-building coverage that the writing surface demanded. The chalk block, now noticeably smaller than it had been when you began, went back to its place on the bench, and you took up the folded square of raw wool cloth that hung from a hook near the window. The cloth was a piece of undyed, unbleached wool, woven loosely so that its surface was slightly napped and soft, and it had been used for buffing so many times that its fibers were impregnated with chalk and pumice dust, giving it a slightly stiff, greyish texture even after washing. You opened the fold, shook the cloth once to dislodge any loose particles, and then crumpled it into a loose ball that fit easily into your palm. The buffing cloth was the final tool of the preparation, and its work was the gentlest of all. A slow, circular polishing that would remove the excess chalk, burnish the surface to a delicate luster, and leave the vellum in the state that the scribes expected when they opened a new gathering of pages. You began at the upper left corner as always, pressing the cloth against the chalked grain side with a light, even pressure, and moving it in the same small, overlapping circles that you had used with the pumice. The sound of the buffing was almost inaudible, a soft, brushing whisper. The sound of wool moving against a smooth, dusty surface, a sound so quiet that you heard it only because the room was so still. Under the cloth, the chalk film began to change, its matte whiteness giving way to a gentle, pearlescent sheen, a luster that was neither glossy nor flat, but something in between, a surface quality that seemed to hold light suspended within it. The excess chalk came away on the cloth in a fine white drift, and you paused every few minutes to shake the cloth out over the growing pile of scrapings on the floor, a pale cloud rising and settling before you resumed. The circular motion of the buffing was deeply repetitive, and your mind settled into it the way it had settled into the scraping and the polishing. A quiet, drifting state where the work did itself and you simply watched, present but not directing, your hand moving in its practiced patterns while your thoughts wandered through calm, unconnected images. You thought of the river at dawn, the way the light touched the water in long, smooth streaks, and you thought of the smell of the lime pits near the tannery, and you thought of nothing at all for stretches of time. The circles continuing, the surface brightening, the cloth growing, warmer in your hand from the friction. The vellum, under the buffing cloth, underwent its final transformation of the day. The chalked pallor faded, replaced by a rich, warm ivory tone, the color of old light, the color of beeswax, the color of parchment that had been prepared with patient, unhurried care. The surface developed a delicate, even sheen, a slight reflectiveness that caught the late afternoon sun and scattered it softly, and the texture under the cloth changed from the faint granularity of the chalk to a smooth, almost silken glide. You could feel the difference through the wool, a change in the resistance, and you knew from that feeling that the buffing was nearly complete. You continued for a few more minutes, working your way across the entire sheet until every part of the grain side had received the cloth's gentle polish, and then you stepped back and let the wool fall to your side. The vellum glowed. It seemed, in the golden light of the late afternoon, to emit its own soft radiance, a quiet internal luminescence that came from the combination of the hide's natural translucence and the polished chalk filling its pores, and you looked at it for a long moment, taking in the even color, the smooth surface, the absolute absence of flaw or blemish. The sheet was now ready for the scribe, ready to receive the ruled lines and the careful lettering and the brilliant illuminations that would make it a page in a book of hours, a page that would be turned by hands long after your own hands were still. You did not think of this in words. You felt it as a quiet, wordless satisfaction, the knowledge of work done properly and completely, and you let that feeling settle into you as you folded the buffing cloth and hung it back on its hook. The day's light was deepening toward evening now, the window's glow shifting from gold to amber to a soft, dusky orange that stretched the frame's shadow across the floor and up the far wall, and the room, which had been warm all afternoon, began to cool slightly, the first hint of the evening chill entering through the gaps around the window. The vellum, still stretched in its frame, looked almost luminous against the darkening room, a pale, perfect rectangle that held the last of the day's light, and you decided to leave it there overnight, still in tension, to allow the chalk to set fully into the pores before you removed it for the final inspection and trimming. You would tend to that in the morning, in the first light over the Seine. But for now, the skin had reached the end of its preparation, and you had reached the end of your part in its long journey from pasture to page. The next morning arrived with the same grey, gradual light that had filled the workshop the day before, the dawn creeping over the rooftops and pressing softly through the oiled linen panes, and you entered the room to find the vellum still stretched in its frame, exactly as you had left it. The chalk had set overnight, the moisture you had flicked onto the skin before the second scraping now fully evaporated, the mineral filling hardened within the pores, and the surface when you approached it had a settled, permanent look, as if the vellum had finally finished becoming what it was meant to be. You hung your cloak on its peg, washed your hands in the cool water of the basin, tied the apron around your waist, and crossed to the frame, your boots making the same soft sounds on the same dark boards, the workshop as still and quiet as it always was at the beginning of the day. You stood for a moment before the frame, looking at the sheet with the assessing gaze of someone who knew every inch of its surface, and then you reached for the pegs, loosening them one by one in the counterclockwise order that released the tension evenly, the flax cords going slack with faint, familiar creaks. As the four-sided pull relaxed, the vellum sagged slightly in its frame, its surface losing the drumhead tightness and becoming a soft, flexible sheet that you lifted away with both hands, your fingers supporting it from beneath at the corners. The skin was cool and smooth, and it had a new lightness in your hands, a weightlessness that came from the removal of so much material over the previous day's scraping and polishing, and you carried it across the room toward the window, where the morning light was now strong enough to read by. The window, with its oiled linen panes, diffused the east-facing sun into a soft, even glow that filled the upper half of the room, and you stopped directly before it, positioning yourself so that the light fell full upon the vellum when you raised it. You lifted the sheet with both hands, your arms extended, your fingers gripping the edges lightly, and you held it up against the brightness, the skin becoming a rectangle of transmitted light that seemed to float before you, its color warming to a deep honeyed ivory wherever the sun passed through it. The window's glow, filtered by the linen and by the morning haze, was gentle and shadowless, the ideal light for inspection. A light that revealed every internal feature of the hide without casting harsh shadows or false highlights, and you began the slow, methodical examination that would determine whether the sheet was fit for the scribes. Your eyes moved across the glowing surface in a pattern you had followed 1,000 times, starting at the upper left corner and traveling slowly to the right, then dropping down a hand's width and moving left. A serpentine path that covered every part of the sheet without missing a single finger's breadth of area. The vellum, against the light, disclosed its inner structure as a map of subtle variations. The faint, branching traces of veins that you had noted the day before, now visible as delicate, translucent lines. The slightly denser shadow along the old spine ridge, a pale, ghostly column running from top to bottom. The thinner areas near the flanks, glowing a brighter, warmer gold, while the thicker edges held a cooler, grayer tone. None of these variations were flaws. They were the natural character of the material, the quiet signature of the animal that had given its hide, and they would not interfere with the scribe's work. What you were looking for were true imperfections, dark spots where the liming had left a trace of pigment, tiny islands of opacity where the fibers had clumped during stretching, and most importantly, any remaining unevenness in thickness that would cause the scribe's quill to catch or the illuminator's gold to lie unevenly. You found the first small spot near the center, a pinhead-sized darkness that you would have missed if the light had not been so perfect. It was not a hole, not a thin spot, but a tiny concentration of natural pigment, a fleck of the calf's original coloring that had survived the lime bath and the scraping and the pumice, embedded deep in the fibers. You noted its position with a quiet internal marker and continued your methodical scan, your eyes moving in their serpentine path while the vellum remained suspended before you, your arms steady, your breathing slow. Further down, in the lower right quadrant, you discovered a second imperfection, a slightly uneven patch where the fibers had gathered into a subtle, almost invisible ridge, a place where your scraping had not fully leveled the surface, and you marked that too. There were also areas where the thickness, though acceptable by most standards, was not yet the perfect uniform transparency that a book of hours demanded, places near the very edges where the skin had been a shade thicker, and the light passed through with a cooler, more opaque tone than the warm gold at the center. These were not flaws, so much as tasks still incomplete, and you added them to the quiet list that was forming in your mind, the list of small corrections that would occupy the next part of your morning. The inspection required no written record. Your fingers and your eyes remembered, and the vellum itself, held against the light, was the only document you needed. When your eyes had traced the last line of their serpentine path across the entire sheet, you lowered the vellum slowly, letting your arms rest, and you stood for a moment in the window's light, with the skin held loosely against your apron. The morning outside was waking fully now. The sounds of the city beginning to rise, a cart passing in the street, the distant call of a boatman on the river, the ever-present swallows beginning their first flights under the eaves. But you hardly heard these sounds. Your attention still held within the quiet circle of the inspection. You turned from the window and carried the vellum back to the workbench, laying it flat with the grain side up, the surface smooth and glowing against the dark, seasoned elm. From the bench you retrieved the miniature blade, the small, bone-handled lunellum that you kept for precisely this kind of delicate, localized work. Its blade was no longer than your thumb, curved and keen, with a point fine enough to address a single errant fiber, and you lifted it with the same care you always used, the smooth, polished bone handle fitting into the hollow of your palm, the blade catching the light in a tiny, bright crescent. You leaned over the bench, your face close to the vellum, and you began to address each imperfection in turn. The first dark spot, the pinhead of pigment near the center, required a touch so light that the blade barely touched the surface. You breathed on the area to add the slightest moisture, the mist of your breath settling on the skin for a heartbeat before beginning to fade. And then you positioned the miniature blade's tip precisely at the edge of the speck and lifted it away with a single, delicate push, a motion that was less a scrape and more a nudge, the visible fleck detaching from the surface and falling aside, so small that you could not see it land. The area beneath was clean and uniform, the same warm ivory as the surrounding skin, and you blew on it gently to clear any remaining dust before moving on to the next. The second correction, the subtle ridge in the lower right quadrant, required a different technique. You held the miniature blade at a slightly higher angle, its edge skimming across the ridge in a series of short, overlapping strokes that you directed with your fingertips rather than your wrist, each stroke removing a filament of material so fine that it seemed like a single hair lifted from the surface. The ridge diminished stroke by stroke, its shadow against the light from the window growing fainter until it merged into the surrounding plane, and then you stopped, checked the area with a light touch of your fingertip, and nodded once, a small, nearly imperceptible motion before moving on. The edge areas, where the thickness needed a final reduction, took the most time. You worked along the perimeter of the sheet, first the upper edge, then the left, then the right, then the lower, holding the miniature blade at the same shallow angle you had used for the major scraping, but making strokes that were only a finger's length, short and controlled, each one lifting a whisper-thin curl that drifted to the bench in a tiny, curling wisp. The work was painstaking, and it required a patience that you had cultivated over many years, a willingness to stand still and repeat the same small motion until the thickness matched the thickness of the center, until the light, when you held the sheet up again, passed through every part with the same warm, even blow. You paused often to carry the vellum back to the window and check your progress, holding it up as before, scanning the edges and then returning to the bench to reduce a little more, the corrections growing smaller and smaller until finally there was nothing left to correct. When the last tiny stroke was complete, you lifted the vellum a final time and carried it to the window for the ultimate inspection, the one that would determine whether it was ready to leave your hands. The full morning light, now bright and clear, poured through the skin as if through a pane of the finest alabaster, and you turned the sheet slowly, tilting it this way and that, checking the thickness from every angle, searching for any shadow or opacity that you might have missed. The light revealed nothing but its own warm golden passage, the vellum a perfect uniform medium for illumination, as flawless as your skill could achieve. You lowered it, and for a moment you simply held it in both hands, the sheet that had passed through every stage of your craft, and then you carried it back to the bench and laid it down with the grain side facing up, the surface clean and ready. The final step before the trimming was to flatten the vellum. to ensure that it would lie perfectly still under the scribe's quill and the illuminator's brush, and for this you used a set of smooth river stones that you kept in a small wooden box beneath the bench. You opened the box, the lid lifting with a soft, dry creak, and you took out the stones one by one, placing them on the bench beside the vellum. There were 8 stones in all, each one roughly the size and shape of a flattened egg, their surfaces worn to a glassy smoothness by centuries of water, tumbling them down the bed of a river that flowed somewhere far from Paris. The colors of the stones were various: a pale grey, a darker blue-grey, a warm brown, a greenish grey, a soft mottled white. And they were cool to the touch, their polished surfaces holding the memory of the cold water from which they had been gathered long before you were born. You positioned the first stone near the upper left corner of the vellum, its weight just enough to anchor the sheet without leaving an impression, and then you placed the others in turn, one near each corner and one along each edge, then 2 smaller stones in the center to prevent any ripple or lift, the arrangement balanced and careful. The stones rested on the vellum like sleeping creatures, their rounded forms casting small soft shadows on the pale surface, and under their weight the sheet lay absolutely flat, its edges curling nowhere, its surface a perfect calm plane that would remain so until you trimmed it later that day. You looked at the arrangement for a moment, adjusting the position of one stone by a finger's width so that the distribution was even, and then you stepped back from the bench, wiping your hands on the apron. The sheet was nearly finished. It rested under the river stones, quiet and still, a page that had been transformed from a rough, lime-soaked hide into a luminous, chalk-polished surface worthy of the prayers and illuminations it would soon carry. The workshop, which had held your attention all morning, settled around you in a deep, calm quiet. The light from the window climbing higher, the motes of dust drifting in their slow, eternal dance, and you stood in the center of the room for a long, quiet moment, letting the stillness of the completed work settle into your bones before turning your thoughts to the trimming and the scriptorium that waited beyond the rear door. The river stones rested on the vellum like sleeping creatures, their smooth, cool weights holding the sheet in its perfect flatness, while you turned to the task that would give it its final shape. From the workbench you gathered the brass ruler, a thin strip of metal no wider than 2 of your fingers and slightly longer than the full width of the vellum, its surface darkened by age to a deep, dull brown, except along the edge, where years of guiding knives had burnished it to a faint, golden gleam. The ruler was cool and weighty in your hand, its straightness absolute, and you placed it on the bench beside the vellum before reaching for the trimming knife, a tool that differed from the lunellum in every particular, its blade straight and short and truly sharp, honed to a fine, bright edge that could sever a thread of silk with only the weight of the blade itself. You checked the edge against your thumbnail, a habit so old it felt like breathing, and then you lifted the stones from the vellum one by one, returning them to their wooden box in the same order you had placed them, their cool, polished surfaces clicking softly against one another as they settled into their resting places. The vellum, freed from its weights, lay flat on the elmwood with no tendency to curl or lift, the chalk and pumice having given it the stability that a well-prepared sheet should possess, and you smoothed it once with your palm, pressing out an invisible ripple near the lower edge, before positioning the brass ruler for the first cut. The dimensions of a book of hours were fixed by long tradition, a little taller than a man's hand and a little narrower than its length, proportions that pleased the eye and fit comfortably into the small personal bindings that owners carried with them, and these measurements lived in your memory as precisely as if they had been notched into the ruler itself. You laid the brass strip along the upper edge, aligning it so that the cut would remove the uneven margin where the flax cords had gripped the skin, the small impressions of the cords visible as a faint, regular pattern of indentations that would be trimmed away and discarded. You held the ruler firmly with your left hand, your fingers spread to distribute the pressure evenly, and with your right hand you brought the trimming knife to the edge of the vellum, its tip finding the exact corner where the cut would begin. The first incision was a small, deliberate press that parted the material cleanly, and then you drew the knife along the ruler in a single, steady pull, the blade riding against the brass with a soft, sustained hiss that was higher and sharper than the sound of the lunellum, a sound like a very distant, very fine saw. the vellum separated before the blade in a smooth, continuous line, the severed edge lifting slightly as the cut progressed, a narrow ribbon of trimmed material curling away from the ruler and falling onto the bench in a thin, pale strip that coiled once and lay still. When the cut was complete, you lifted the knife and set it aside, then removed the ruler and inspected the new edge, which was straight and clean and perpendicular to the surface, free of any feathering or tearing, a line as precise as any that a scribe would rule for his text. You rotated the vellum on the bench, aligning the ruler for the second cut along the left side, and you drew the knife again with the same steady, unhurried motion, another narrow ribbon peeling away. Then the right side, then the lower edge, each cut removing the margin that had been gripped by the cords along with a small amount of the worked surface, so that the final rectangle would be pure and even from edge to edge, free of the slight thinning that sometimes occurred where the cords had pulled. The 4 trimmed ribbons lay on the bench in a loose, pale heap, their edges still holding the faint impressions of the flax, and you gathered them together with a sweep of your hand and dropped them into the larger pile of scrapings that had accumulated beneath the frame, the remnants of 2 days' work joining the earlier castings in a soft, pale mound. The vellum was now a perfect rectangle, its proportions exactly as the scribes required, its edges clean and square, its surface a uniform, warm ivory that glowed softly in the midday light. You ran your thumb along each edge, feeling the smooth, crisp cut, and then you lifted the sheet with both hands and held it before you, turning it slightly to catch the light, a final, silent confirmation that it was ready. There was nothing left to scrape, nothing left to polish, nothing left to trim. The sheet had completed its journey through your hands, and the time had come to deliver it. You laid the vellum on a clean, flat board of smooth-planed poplar that you kept for this purpose, a board slightly larger than the sheet itself, and you placed a second, identical board on top, sandwiching the vellum between them so that it would not curl or crease during the short journey to the scriptorium. The boards were pale and lightweight, their surfaces worn to a soft sheen from years of carrying finished pages, and you tied them together with a length of linen tape that you wound twice around the package and knotted with a simple, secure bow. The bundle was light in your hands, its weight barely more than the weight of the wood itself, and you carried it across the workshop toward the rear door that you rarely opened, the door that led not to the street but to the adjoining scriptorium, where the scribes and illuminators worked in their own quiet, their own pool of stillness. The rear door was made of the same dark, seasoned oak as the frame, and its iron latch was cool under your fingers as you lifted it and pushed the door inward. It opened without a sound, its hinges kept well oiled by the same habit of care that governed everything in the workshop, and you stepped through into a room that was at once familiar and foreign, a space you visited only when a skin was finished, but that you knew as well as your own. The scriptorium was larger than your workshop, a long, high-ceilinged chamber that ran the full depth of the building, and its air was different, warmer and stiller, scented with gum arabic and lampblack, and the faint, sweet sharpness of vermilion. The light was different too, coming not from a single window, but from a series of tall, arch openings along the eastern wall, each one glazed with the same oiled linen as your own window, but filtered through a system of angled screens that directed the brightness upward onto the slanted desks without casting shadows across the work. At these desks, arranged in a row down the length of the room, sat the scribes, each one bent over a page in progress, their postures identical in their stillness, their hands moving with the same slow, deliberate precision that you brought to your own work. The nearest scribe was an older man with a fringe of grey hair and ink-stained fingers who was ruling a fresh page with a lead point and a straight edge, drawing the faint, silvery lines that would guide the letters into their ordered rows. And he did not look up as you passed. Beyond him, a younger scribe was copying text from an exemplar propped on a small stand, his quill dipping in and out of the inkpot at measured intervals, the nib scratching softly against the vellum with a sound like a mouse moving behind a wall. The text he copied was Latin, the small, dense script of a book of hours, and the letters emerged from his quill in a steady, rhythmic flow, each one formed with the same careful shape as the one before and the one after, a uniformity achieved by years of patient repetition. Further down the room, at a desk that received the strongest light from the windows, The master illuminator was working on a page that lay flat before him, its surface already covered with text, but awaiting the decorated initials and the miniature paintings that would make it a thing of beauty. His desk held a small array of materials arranged with the same precise order you maintained at your own bench. Shells of ground pigment in soft, mounded piles of blue and red and green. A pot of gold leaf that glittered faintly, even in the diffused light. Brushes of fine sable hair lying in a neat row on a folded cloth, and in the center, a page partially illuminated, its capital letter glowing with raised gold and deep, brilliant ultramarine. The master illuminator did not look up either, his attention entirely absorbed by the tiny brush he was guiding across the vellum, his hand so steady that the tip of the brush seemed to move without the hand moving, a suspension of motion that you recognized because you had achieved it yourself 1,000 times with the lunellum. The room held a profound quiet, a silence deeper even than the silence of your workshop, because here the quiet was shared, multiplied by the number of workers, each one sealed in their own concentration, their breathing shallow and slow, their movements minimal. The only sounds were the soft scratching of quills, the faint clink of a brush being rinsed in a clay pot of water, the whisper of a page being turned, and the gentle, pervasive rustle of the building settling around its occupants. The scriptorium had no need of bells or spoken words. The light itself marked the hours, and the work moved forward in its own calm, internal rhythm, as steady and inevitable as the tide. You walked down the length of the room toward the desk of the head scribe, a man you had known for many years whose name you rarely spoke, because names were unnecessary in the quiet economy of the workshop and the scriptorium. His desk was at the far end, near a window that looked onto the same courtyard that your own window overlooked, and he was seated on a high stool, examining a finished page through a small, convex lens of polished crystal that magnified the letters and revealed any imperfection. He looked up as you approached, his eyes pale and calm above the lens, and he set the page aside with the careful, unhurried motion that characterized everything in this room. You placed the bundled boards on the corner of his desk, untying the linen tape and lifting the upper board to reveal the vellum beneath. The sheet glowed in the light from the window, its ivory surface warming to a soft, honeyed radiance, and the head scribe leaned forward to look at it, his gaze moving across the surface in the same serpentine path that your own gaze had followed that morning. He was checking your work as you had checked it, looking for the same flaws, the same uneven patches, the same tiny imperfections, and you stood quietly while he did so, your hands folded loosely before you, your expression neutral and patient. After a long moment, the head scribe lifted his gaze from the vellum and met your eyes. He did not speak, but he gave a single brief nod, a small dip of the chin that meant the sheet was acceptable, that it would do, that your work was complete. You answered with the same nod, the same wordless acknowledgement, and then you placed the upper board back over the vellum and retied the linen tape, leaving the bundle on his desk for him to distribute to whichever scribe was next in the rotation. The exchange had taken less than a minute, and it had contained everything that needed to be said. You turned from the desk and walked back through the scriptorium, passing the illuminator who was still absorbed in his tiny golden brushwork, passing the young scribe who had finished a line of text and was refilling his quill, passing the older man who had completed his ruling and was now selecting a new sheet from a stack at his elbow. None of them looked up, and you did not expect them to. You were part of the quiet machinery of the place, the supplier of the surfaces on which their work depended, and your presence was as unremarkable as the presence of the light or the air. The door to your workshop closed behind you with the same silent, oiled motion, and you stood once again in your own room, the familiar smells of hide and chalk and pumice wrapping around you like a familiar garment. The workshop was quiet now, the frame empty, the bench clear except for the tools that awaited cleaning, and you crossed to the bench with the same steady, unhurried pace that you had maintained throughout the 2 days of work. The cleaning of the tools was the final ritual, the act that closed the circle of the task, and you performed it with the same care you gave to every other part of your craft. The lunellum was first, its curved blade still carrying a fine film of vellum dust, and you wiped it thoroughly with the linen rag, drawing the cloth along the bevel until the metal shone, then dipping a corner of the rag in the water pot and wiping the blade again to remove any remaining chalk, drying it with a fresh fold of the cloth until it gleamed. The miniature blade received the same treatment, its tiny edge cleaned with a delicate, precise touch, and then the pumice stone, which you brushed with a stiff bristled brush to remove the dust from its pores, and the chalk block, which you wiped with a dry cloth and returned to its place on the shelf. The brass ruler was polished with the rag, the trimming knife wiped and sheathed, the buffing cloth shaken out and hung on its hook, the water pot emptied into the basin and refilled from the pitcher for the next day. When every tool was clean and in its appointed place, you swept the floor with a broom of bound twigs that leaned in the corner, gathering the great pale mound of scrapings and dust into a neat pile, which you scooped into a small wooden bucket. The scrapings would go to the glue maker who worked on the other side of the quarter, a man who boiled vellum remnants into the size that the illuminators used for their gesso and their pigments, and you would leave the bucket outside your door for his boy to collect. The bucket was only half full, and when you set it by the door, you noted that the pile looked small for 2 days' work, a sign of how efficiently you had scraped, how little waste you had produced. The room was now clean and orderly, the frame standing empty and waiting, the vellum delivered, the tools gleaming on the bench, the sun in the window sliding toward its afternoon angle. You stood in the center of the workshop for a long moment, your hands resting at your sides, your breathing easy and slow, and you let the quiet of the completed work settle around you. Then you reached for the apron strings, untying them with fingers that knew the knot by touch, and you lifted the apron over your head and hung it on its peg, where it would wait for the next skin, the next frame, the next slow, patient transformation. The workshop was clean and the tools were in their places, the lunellum aligned on its folded cloth, the pumice stone resting beside the chalk block, the brass ruler straight along the edge of the bench, and now only the unfinished skins remained, the half-prepared sheets that waited under their damp cloth in the corner. You crossed to them, your footsteps on the boards the last sounds of your working day, and you knelt beside the stack, lifting the heavy, cool cloth that covered them, and releasing the moist, clean smell of hides in progress. The skins lay in a neat pile of 5, each one at a different stage. 2 that had been scraped on the grain side only, 1 that had been stretched but not yet touched by the lunellum, 1 that was still stiff from its first drying and needed soaking, and 1 that was nearly finished, lacking only the pumice and the chalk. You checked them one by one, your fingers brushing their surfaces to feel the moisture, noting that the top skin was beginning to dry along its edges where the cloth had lifted slightly during the day, and you rearranged the stack so that the driest skins were at the bottom and the dampest at the top. Then you re-wetted the cloth from the water pot, wringing it out until it was evenly moist but not dripping, and draped it over the pile, tucking the edges under the bottom board so that no air could reach the hides. The skins would keep through the night and into the next day, waiting for your hands, and you pressed the cloth down one final time before rising and brushing the dust from your knees. The light through the window had shifted while you worked, the bright gold of afternoon giving way to a softer, mellower tone, the first hint of evening entering the room, and you felt the day's work settling into your body. A pleasant, diffuse tiredness that was not exhaustion, but the quiet satisfaction of muscles well used. You walked to the window and stood before it, as you had stood at midday, your forearms resting on the sill, and you looked out at the lane and the rooftops beyond. The sun was lowering behind the buildings, its direct light no longer entering the room, and the sky above the roofs had taken on the pale, transparent blue that precedes dusk, a color like thin, watered milk. A few clouds, high and motionless, had begun to show the faintest tint of rose along their eastern edges, and the shadows on the lane below had deepened and merged, swallowing the cobbles into a soft grey dusk. You turned from the window and went to the basin, where you splashed water on your face, the coolness washing away the fine dust of the day, and you dried your skin with the linen rag, pressing it to your cheeks and forehead and the back of your neck. Then you took your cloak from its peg, the woolen fabric still carrying the faint outdoor coolness from the morning, and you swung it around your shoulders, fastening the simple clasp at your throat with a practiced, one-handed motion. The workshop was dim now, the objects in the corners retreating into shadow, the frame standing like a patient, silent skeleton, and you cast a last habitual look around the room, checking that the water pot was full for the morning, that the broom was leaning in its corner, that the bucket of scrapings was by the door for the glue maker's boy, and finding everything in its order, you lifted the latch and stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind you with a soft thud. The air in the lane was cool and still, cooler than the air inside the workshop, and it had the particular smell of a Parisian evening, a blend of stone dust and river water and the faint, distant smoke of cooking fires being lit across the quarter. You stood for a moment in the threshold, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness, and then you turned left, walking slowly toward the river, your boots making the same steady, soft sound on the cobbles that they had made on the floorboards. But now the sound was part of a larger, quiet, the hush of the city winding down. The lane led you past the courtyard, where the woman had washed linen of midday, now empty and silent, the washboard leaning against the wall, the tub turned on its side and already dry. A cat, grey and lean, sat on the courtyard wall washing its paw, and it paused to watch you pass with eyes that caught the last light as two pale green glints before returning to its grooming. Beyond the courtyard, the lane narrowed and then opened onto the Quai de la Tournelle, the long paved walk that ran along the left bank of the Seine, and as you stepped onto it, the river opened before you, a broad, moving expanse of pewter and silver that filled half the world. The Seine at evening was a different river from the Seine of the morning, its surface no longer glittering with sunlight, but holding the sky in a vast, inverted mirror. The water was a deep, muted blue-grey, and across it, in long, smooth bands, lay the reflections of the fading sky, streaks of slate and dusky rose and pale lavender that shifted and merged as the current moved beneath them. The river seemed to be breathing, its surface lifting and falling in slow, almost imperceptible swells that were not waves, but the deep, muscular movement of water flowing toward the sea, and the sound it made was a low, constant murmur, a sound you felt as much as heard, the voice of the river that never stopped speaking. You turned westward along the quay, walking at an easy, unhurried pace, your hands tucked loosely into the sleeves of your cloak, your gaze moving across the water, and the far bank and the sky. On the opposite side of the river, the buildings of the island and the right bank were beginning to lose their detail, their windows turning from grey to gold as candles and lamps were lit within, each one a small, warm point of light that glowed softly against the deepening blue. The great mass of Notre Dame rose above the rooftops, its towers dark against the pale sky, and as you watched, the first star appeared above its spire, a single, steady point of silver that you noticed and then released, letting it join the quiet panorama. Along the quay, the boatmen were ending their day. You passed a barge that was being tied up for the night, its hull bumping gently against the stone quay as the boatman, a stocky man in a leather cap, loops thick hemp ropes around the iron mooring rings set into the wall. He worked with the same steady, practiced rhythm that you knew from your own scraping, his movements economical and sure, and he did not look up as you passed. His attention was on the rope and the ring and the gentle, stubborn pull of the river. Further on, a second barge had already been secured, and the lantern hung from its stern, casting a small, wavering circle of orange light on the water, the reflection breaking into 1,000 shifting fragments with each ripple before reassembling. The boatman on this second barge was seated on a coil of rope, eating a piece of bread, and the smell of the bread reached you across the water, a faint, homey scent that caught at something quiet and deep. You walked on, the quay stretching ahead of you in the gathering dusk, and you passed a fishmonger's stall that was closing for the day, the wooden trays being stacked in the remaining ice brought down from the mountains and stored in deep cellars, melting slowly on the stones in small glittering pools. The fishmonger nodded to you as you passed, a slight, wordless acknowledgement of shared existence in the quarter, and you returned the nod without breaking your stride. Beyond the stall, a narrow street opened to your left, and from it came the sound of a woman singing, a low, melodic song that drifted out through an open upper window before the shutter was pulled closed and the sound was cut off, leaving only the river's murmur. The light continued to fade, the bands of color on the water deepening from rose to violet to a soft, muted gray, and the sky above the western rooftops, where the sun had long since descended, held a final pale wash of gold that would persist for a while yet before yielding to full night. You paused by the low stone parapet and leaned against it, looking down at the water that moved past just below your feet, close enough that you could smell it, the cool, slightly weedy scent of the river, and you watched the current carrying small dark leaves and a single white feather downstream at the same unhurried pace that governed everything in this hour. From somewhere behind you, in the maze of streets that climbed away from the river toward the butcher's district, came a distant, lowing sound, the voice of cattle being brought into the city for the next day's markets. The sound was faint and mournful and deeply calm, a thread of ancient pastoral noise woven into the texture of the city evening, and it rose and fell and then faded, absorbed by the stone walls and the water's murmur. You listened until it was gone, and then you pushed yourself upright from the parapet and continued your walk. Your lodging was not far now, a narrow building on a small street just off the quay, and you reached it as the last daylight was leaving the sky and the lanterns along the river were beginning to multiply, their reflections scattering across the water like handfuls of dropped gold. The street door was unlocked, as it always was at this hour, and you pushed it open and stepped into the small, dark hallway that smelled of old wood and cooking and the faint, dusty scent of the plaster walls. You climbed the narrow wooden stairs, your hand on the worn, smooth railing, your feet finding the familiar creaks of each step, the third step that groaned in the middle, the seventh step that shifted slightly under your weight, the small landing where the stair turned, and a tiny, high window let in the last of the dusk. Your room was at the top of the stairs, a small chamber under the eaves with a sloping ceiling and a single window that faced west toward the river. You opened the door, which had no lock but only a simple latch, and entered, the room dim and quiet, its air slightly warm from having been closed all day. The furnishings were few and simple: a narrow bed against one wall, a wooden chest at its foot, a small table with a clay pitcher and cup, and a stool beneath the window. You crossed to the window and unlatched the shutters, pushing them outward, and the evening air flowed in, cool and fresh, carrying with it the sound of the river and the faint, distant tolling of a bell. The bell was the bell for Compline, ringing from the chapel of a small convent somewhere across the water, its notes slow and measured and deeply peaceful, each one hanging in the air for a long moment before the next, the sound traveling across the darkening city like ripples across a pond. You stood at the window, your hands resting on the sill, and you listened to the bell and watched the last light fade from the sky, while the stars, now numerous, grew brighter and sharper, and the river below, visible as a dark, moving ribbon between the buildings, caught the reflection of the emerging moon in a long, silver path. The bell ceased, its final note lingering and then subsiding into the quiet, and you turned from the window, leaving the shutters open to the night. You removed your cloak and hung it on a peg by the door, then unlaced your boots and set them side by side beneath the window. The bed was simple, a straw-filled mattress laid over a wooden frame and covered with a woolen blanket, and you pulled back the blanket and lay down, your body settling into the shallow, familiar depression that your form had worn over many nights. The mattress rustled softly beneath you, and then it was still. Lying there, you listened to the night sounds that entered through the open window, a quieter version of the midday sounds, softer and more widely spaced. The river murmured against the stone quay with a gentle, rhythmic lapping, a sound that had no beginning and no end, and somewhere a dog barked twice and then fell silent. The wooden buildings settled around you with small, occasional creaks, the same sounds your own frame made when the pegs were tightened, and far off, in the direction of the butcher's district, the lowing of the cattle had ceased entirely. The air that flowed through the window was cool on your face and hands, and you pulled a blanket up to your shoulders, its weight a soft, familiar comfort. You did not think of the day's work, though your hands still held the ghost of the lunellum's handle and the memory of the vellum's smoothness. You did not think of the skins that waited under their damp cloth, or the page you had delivered to the scriptorium, or the scribes who would soon write upon it. These thoughts were present but distant, like the lights on the far bank, and they drifted through your awareness without catching, carried away by the slow, steady current of your breathing, which had matched the rhythm of the scraping and the polishing and the buffing, now found a new rhythm, deeper and slower, a rhythm that belonged to the night and the river and the stars. The moon, which you could not see from your bed but whose light you could sense as a faint, silver coolness in the air, rose higher over the city, and its reflection on the Seine lengthened and narrowed, a path of light that led from the quay to the far horizon. The sound of the water against the stone was the last sound you heard clearly, a liquid whisper that wrapped around the silence and held it, and then even that sound began to soften, to blur, to merge with the quiet breathing of the room, until the boundary between the river and the room and your own slow settling mind became indistinguishable, and you slipped gently, without noticing, into sleep. Gently.